Okay, once again, welcome everybody here. And thank you so much for taking your time in your busy day to learn RPA. And again, like this is one of the best ways where you can like use like 1 or 2 hours of your day to learn like either Studio or StudioX. But for this session, we are tailored more towards the Studio. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat or even like use the RPA forum thread. So once you've registered, like I bet like you've all gone through the registration process of signing up for the automation cloud portal and downloading the software to your machines. So by this time, I assume like everyone has the Studio installed on your machines. And if you've got like StudioX by any chance, just like you can use the settings to switch your profiles. So if you do have any questions, again, like feel free to use the chat. Okay. All right. So for today's agenda, we have a couple of very basic topics because like we said, we want to give you everything what Studio has to offer. Before we go there, which is where like you need to understand the basic concepts to build your foundation. So we will learn about the variables, what are the different data types that we will be dealing with, and what UiPath Studio workflow layouts are, and then like what arguments, and how to use like the conditional loops and the conditional statements that are available. And during each of these sessions, like we will switch between like how the Studio looks so that like you get familiar with the activities that are there. And like we will also like walk you through a couple of demos. And also pay attention because like we will be having some fun quiz in between for you to like participate as well. And don't worry, like this is just to keep your interaction. So if you get it wrong, there's nothing wrong. Okay, you would still go through the final assessment. All right, so let's move on and learn like what is variables. Okay, so assume that variables are like a placeholder. It is a container for you to hold the values. So every time like all of us deal with like applications and like most of us deal with data. So you need a place to hold that data, right? So when you're building these workflows within UiPath, you need like a place for the data, which is where like variables come in place, where like you can give a unique name to it and say like, this is what this data means. And you can specify what type of data that is. So for example, here we have RPA developer at UiPath.com, and you want to use this in your automation. And you need a place to store this, which is where you will create a variable called as email address. So using that variable, now you don't have to type this RPA developer at UiPath.com every single time that you need to call it. Instead, you can just use this email address within your automation, and you know that your automation will recognize this every time you use it. Okay. And you need to understand why are variables important. Variables like basically help you pass the data from one activity to another. So when you build your workflow, you're going to have like hundreds of activities depending on like how complex your automation is going to be. So if you have like various sections and you want to pass that data from one area to another, which is where the variables become a very good placeholder for you to pass that value. Okay. And when you are like building more complex automations, what happens is it would be like impossible for you to keep track of all the values, which is why like you have this like centralized like variables panel where you can review like what are the variables that you currently have and like what are the placeholders that you have in the default values. Okay. Let's just move this ahead. Okay. So within Studio, there are multiple ways to create these variables. Okay. So the first option that we have is to use the variables panel. So for a second, I'm going to switch to Studio. Okay. So if you all have like installed Studio, all I did was like went ahead and like created a very simple project here. And I created this process. And again, like once you hit like create a process, it'll ask you like, where do you want to store? Just like how you use like Microsoft Office, you give a file name to your project and it goes and stores in the location that you have specified. Okay. So the very first time that you create like an empty project for this session, I'm calling this the session 2 demo, and give meaningful names so that like you can use that and you can reference that later. Okay. So when you have Studio here, this is the default layout that you might be seeing. Okay. So you might have the activities panel here, and if it's not seen, don't worry, it might be like sidelined over here. So if it's stuck on this side, you can always like click and it would show up. Okay. So, and if you don't see like you're on a different tab, always go and at the bottom left, yeah, this is the left. At the bottom left, like you can click on the activities and you can see the activities panel here. And this central area is what we call the designer panel. Okay, so this is where like most of the time that we will be doing our actions here. So this is where you will be building your activities, your automation. And on this side, you can have your output window, the properties, the error list, like all the additional windows will be available for you here. Okay, once you create like a brand new workflow, you can go ahead and add like a simple sequence. And I'm just going to like show you what variables panel is. So I'm just going to include a simple sequence. And for today's session, I would recommend like create your first process, and like we will name each workflow to the actions that we are going to do. Okay, so that way it's easier to follow along. And if you want to have separate processes, that's totally up to your preference. Okay, so in this designer panel at the very bottom, do you see the 3 tabs? This first tab is called the variables panel. So this is where you can create your variables. So if I click on this create variable right here, you see it gives me a default name. And this is where like you would specify what's the variable name that you would like to give and the type, and also like what is the scope. So like if you have like multiple sequences or like multiple building blocks inside, you can specify like where do you want this variable. So the scope basically defines like how long do you want this variable to be accessible. If you want a variable to be accessible only within a specific sequence, you can specify that. If you want it for the entire workflow, you can also specify that here. And since we have like only one sequence you see in this dropdown, I only have one option. But if you do have like multiple layers, you would see the other areas here. Okay, so the first option that we have here is to open the variables panel. And from there, you can click the create new variable, which we saw right now. And then the second option is to use the designer panel. We all know which is the designer panel, right? So right here in the middle, this is called the designer panel. Okay, in here, now I have like a very simple activity, but I need some place to hold it. So I'm just going to drop an assign here, and using this, now I can create a variable. Okay, so as you can see in the designer panel, we are just going to input any activity that you want, and we will create a variable. So I'm going to use this too. I clicked right here, and then I'm going to press the shortcut key Control plus K.
Yeah. शुरू में देखते हैं ना बचपन में टीवी में कि सबसे ऊपर फेस वही है मतलब बाकी जैसे भगवान ने
Can you please put yourself on mute? Excuse me. Can everybody please put themselves on mute? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we have our basic activity here, which I called from here. I search for assign, and you can just double click or drag and drop, and you'll have your first activity. And then I'm going to use my shortcut key Control plus K, K as in kite. Okay. So once I do that, it gives me an option to like give a name for the variable. Okay. So I'm just going to call it like number 1. Okay. That's the variable that I want. And I'm going to give it a value here. So since I used it as like a string, so I'm going to put double quotes and I'll put like 1, 2, 3. That's my value. So here we have created a variable using the designer panel. Okay. And the third option is to use the properties panel. Okay, so you can use like varying like activities, like let's say for instance you have like extract data, so you're using like web automation where you're interacting and scraping values from web interface like a website, and then you use an activity like get text or like extract data table, and those activities have an output variable, which is where you can use the same shortcut key, which is the control K, to set the values. So whatever that you extracted from that website can be stored in that variable. And you can specify all that with a name, with a unique name. So if you have questions on like, where can I find all my variables? Like what are the different variables? And you have so many different options to create them. Always, when in doubt, come to this variables panel here, and you will be able to see like all the variables that are available for that workflow, depending on like your scope. So if you're inside like a specific sequence, I would say like click outside and you should be able to see everything here. Okay. All right. So we saw like the 3 different ways to create a variable. Now you need to know like how to configure these variables. So if you're creating from the variables panel itself, you have like four properties there. So the first thing is you give it a name, a unique name, so that you know like what value it's holding. So don't just give it as like, if you're going to store like 1, 2, 3, don't just give it like 1, 2, 3 as the variable name. Instead, give it like, what is that value that you're storing right there? Is it like an invoice ID? Is it like a department ID? Like what is the identifier that you want to store? It could be anything, but give it a unique name so that you will come back and when you see it, you know what that means. Okay. And then the second thing that we want to specify here is about the type. So what kind of data are we storing? So these variables, like you're storing like literally data, and data can come in like different forms and types. So which is where like this type is like usually used to specify what kind of data are we storing. So like I mentioned, if you're storing a number, you would store it as an integer. If you're storing like a string, you would specify that text value as a string. And like you can have like complex data types and like collections and like table formats. Those can be stored with the data table. So if you do have like additional data types, we can always like explore that in the next section. Okay. And these variables, you're not just going to like get these values from outside. You can also specify that this variable will have a default value. So whenever you begin the workflow, you want to say like my variable should hold this like 0 or 1 at the beginning, or it should call like the name should always be Priya right there. Then you can start with that value as the default value. But again, like these variables are placeholders. So as it progresses, as your workflow progresses, the value can change. So if you want to assign, like, let's say, like I put the name as Priya, but then like 5 minutes down the lane, like in the workflow, I want to change it to Brian, you can always assign that. So it's just a placeholder. The name is the variable, but the value can change. Okay. And then the fourth part that we are looking at is the scope. So if you look at this variables panel here, you have all these 4 options right here. So this is what we are talking about: the name, the type of the variable, the default value that you want to specify, and the scope. Like I said, the scope is to specify like which workflow or which section of the workflow that you want this variable for. So if you have like multiple sequences inside, let's say like I'll add another sequence here and I call it like add sequence, then I can have like a variable specific only for this add sequence. So if I look outside for this main sequence, I won't be able to see that other variable that we created. The variable 1 is not visible outside. So which is where the scope comes into play. So if you want like this variable 1 to be utilized, you can use it inside this add sequence. So you can have like multiple sections and you keep it like decluttered, like you're not like having like a whole set of variables in like one big layout. All right. Okay, so here are some like common facts that you need to know about like variables within the UiPath. So like the type of the value that is being held is always determined by the data type. So like when we create the variable here, you have to specify a data type. So that way it's a lot easier to categorize what type of value that it holds. Okay. And based on that data type, Some variables can hold single value while the others can hold multiple values. Like I said, you can have like a string that only holds like the name, okay? But you can have a collection like a data table that can hold like a table kind of a format. Like for instance, like you have like an Excel that has like name, ID, city, and all that information. It's like a collection, right? So you want to store that in a table format. That's where the data table type will be useful, okay? And inside Studio, variables can also be configured using the properties. So like I said, if you're using like other activities like get text, or like when you're using like UI-based automations, like you can always have like the output, like right here. Let's see here. Okay, do you see the output here? So under output, you have the value. So using this property panel, you can look at the variables, okay? I'm just going to minimize this for a second. Okay. And another important fact that you need to remember is that these variables are not like static values. So like if you want that values to be like changed throughout your workflow, that's definitely possible. So as your workflow evolves, your values can change and be easily manipulated. All right. Diana, over to you. So here we are going to have our very first quiz question.
Okay, so just a minute. I'm going to put the Menti quiz code in the chat box so you can all grab it.
Okay. Yep, I see the question. Where do we do the quiz? So Diana is going to show you the instructions on how we do the Menti quiz. So if you are using your computer or your phone, just go to menti.com and you're going to use the specific code that Diana has mentioned, 1494.
Okay, and we're waiting for a lot of people, so I'm going to give it just a few minutes so we can see more and more of you joining. This is a lot of fun. There will be a prize at the end. And there's some really good questions tonight, you guys. It'll be fun.
So this is like the moment of truth, like to see like if y'all have been like listening, because like you're gonna have some fun choices here.
That's right. I still see people joining, so I'm just gonna wait a few more seconds. I love looking at all these little floating icons. They're fun.
It's cute.
Okay, let's get started, you guys. So you have to answer fast to get more points. The first question is, what is the shortcut key used to create variables? Is it Windows keys, Control plus key, K, car key, or escape?
Okay, there's a countdown, guys.
Oh, good job.
I love it. Thank you so much, guys. You've been listening.
Yeah.
All right, back to the presentation.
So we're gonna do the leaderboard just to see who's winning so far. But don't worry, there's plenty of time for others to take the lead. It looks like Sean Santa's in the lead. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, here like the fastest finger wins. Awesome. I'm gonna try to share my screen again. All right, I hope y'all can see my screen now. So now
Yes.
we are moving on to the data types. Thanks, Diana. Now we are moving on to the data types. So we all saw like variables are capable of, right? So you need to understand how these variables can be stored in different types. So you can store a name, an ID, a collection. So how do you change these types? Which is where like we will go back to the studio for a second. So you have this variables panel right here. You have the variable type, right? So if you click on this type, you would see a drop down pulling down that shows you all the different types that you can store. So for number, like when I created, the default is always like going to string or a generic value. So we are going to change that to int, a number. So in this case, a number is int 32, meaning that the integer of 32-bit. Okay. And if we want to see like additional like data types, you can always click on browse for data types. And this pulls up like everything within the spectrum of like .NET and like everything within the programming area. So all the varying types of data can be used here. So if you're looking for data table, let's say, you can just use that search about, and you can select the type of data. So I see here the data table is available, and this is the data table that I want to use, the system.data for my instance, and I can use it there. Okay. Another option is just to use this. Like you can use these 5 choices that you have here, or you can like select from the browse. All right. So within all these different data types, there is a UiPath proprietary data type, which is the generic value. So when you're using like automations with web recorders or so, you would get a generic data type, which is like at that moment, you wouldn't know what is the type of data. So it would create a generic value data type. So let's see about the common data types that we currently have. So in our dropdown, we did see a couple of data types that are available. The first one is the string, which is where like you can use to store the text values. For instance, like name, like you want to store like sentences, like you want to store any kind of like text values, you could use string, which is the very common one. The second section that we're going to look at is the numeric types. So if you want to store like numbers, let's say like a phone number without the special characters like the dashes or the parentheses, you can use the integer. So like 10, 299, all these are just numbers. But if you want to store like large numbers, like having like exponential quantities, then you could use the long. And the double comes into play when you have like decimals. So if you do have a specific precision that you want to specify, you can use the double type. So the most common ones that we will be using would be the string, integer, Boolean, and the double, okay? And when it comes to Boolean, the Boolean simply means it's a yes or no type. So it's either true or false. So you can store either it's true or false. So let's go back to the studio for a second. So in this dropdown, you see the very first option is Boolean. So if I go to my variable now, and you can always set it to, so here, I can just change this one to variable 2. And you see this red, like whenever you see that red, don't get scared. It just simply means that you have an error. So you just got to change that. So I'm going to set it to true. And that error will go away. Okay. So if you do see that red exclamation marks, don't worry. It's just simple errors that you can easily fix. All right. So these are the common data types. And here we move on to this like a slightly complicated data types, which is the data table. So if you want to store a table format, a structured like rows and columns like a spreadsheet, which is where you would use the data table. And the next data type that we have is the date time. Obviously, like any automation, you're going to use date and time formats. So you can specify what type of time format that you want, because within Europe and American, like we obviously have like different time formats, and you can easily specify those using this date time data types. Okay, so looking at the generic data type, like I mentioned before, UiPath has its own proprietary data type, which is the generic value. With this one, you can easily store text, numbers, dates, and arrays, meaning that like it's a very generic data type. So you haven't tied it down to a specific type of data. But I would always recommend, like once you get that value in a generic type, later like convert it to the specific type. That way, it's very easier for you to maintain that. And especially like when you're using other activities, like along and you want to do complex calculations, that generic value might not be like compatible when you want to do like mathematical calculations. All right. So if you want to be like very specific with your calculations, I would say like once you get the generic value, come back and use the conversion mechanism to convert it. Okay. So here's an example. So always the first element in that expression gets like is used as the guideline to specify the operation. So we have a variable that is of integer type and a string that also has the same value. So like 1, 2, 3 and 1, 2, 3. And when you try to add them, the result is being stored in a generic value. So since the first one is an integer and addition happens, so it's considered a number and then you get the result. But here in this second case, we have a string which is 1, 2, 3, and the second one is again a 1, 2, 3. As you can see, it just concatenates. It's just looking at them as like a string, a text, not as numbers. So that's why you see 1, 2, 3 and 1, 2, 3 here. All right. So you want to know like when do I use these generic values? So you have the different data types, right? And this is a proprietary UiPath specific data type, and you need to know like when to use this. So whenever you're using like web automation and you're extracting data from a specific system or an application, and you get that data without knowing like what to process, and before that is being forwarded to another workflow without being processed, then you can use this generic data type. And if you have like 2 different versions of the same Excel and you can use it to like compare column by column, then you can use it. And if the columns are in different terms of data type, then I think the generic value will be the only common term that can help you like achieve that. All right. So the next section that we are going to learn is what are the UiPath workflow layouts that we have. So before you understand the layout, you need to understand what is the term workflow mean, okay? So every time, every single automation that you write and every single piece of automation that you write can be a workflow, okay? Sorry, just a second. Sorry. Okay. So within UiPath Studio, you can have like multiple workflows and comprise of your entire automation. Okay, so it is basically a workflow is the place where you write your canvas. Just give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Houston's got like this different varying temperatures, and like when it switches from like super hot to start raining, that shows up with my allergies. Okay, so let's get back to workflows now. So within the studio, we all notice that like we have this designer panel, which is our basic canvas where we design our workflows and we build that automation. So with that designer panel, like where you build your automation, that simple area, like that is your workflow. So I'm going to show you why these workflows are first important. Okay. So these workflows, like building them in like smaller chunks is like very important because they are the most fastest and they're very useful, especially if you can break it down into pieces. So for example, you all must have like played with Lego blocks when you were kids, or if your kids are playing with those. So you see like how those Lego blocks can be built into like an entire structure. Similarly, you need to have your workflows in like small, simple chunks that you can build it up into an entire automation. That way, when you run that specific, like one single block of workflow, it should still be able to execute without any flaws. So that way you can, if you're working on a larger team, it helps you to collaborate with your team members and also like learn from each other. And if there are like testing teams, and if you're working in like especially with the software development, you might have like a development team and a testing team. So this helps if you build a workflow that is only specific to this requirement and you give it to your testing team while you work on another workflow here. So which is where like it helps, it keeps things like very independent. You don't want to have like everything in one workflow and someone changes something and it has like a complete different impact, which is why I will ask you, like when you're building like complex automations, like make your workflows as small as possible. So that way it can be reused in a different automation or even given to an independent team to be like tested or for them to collaborate. Okay. So within UiPath, we have like different layouts. So with the studio, we have a sequence, flowchart, state machine, and the global exception handler. So a sequence is where you would write like multiple activities that goes in a very sequential order. So it starts with that same order and it would execute one activity at a time. Whereas a flowchart would come into a picture where you have like different decisions. Let's say you have like a yes or no type of decision, and based on that, you would have to go back and recheck, and then you can like build like complex business processes. That's where you would go for like a flowchart. A state machine is a series of actions that happens within that state, and once that action is completed, you can specify certain condition. Depending on that state, depending on the current state of that activity, it would move on to the next state. And a global exception handler is where you can write your exception handling mechanism for like an overall exception within your automation. So I'm going to show you in Studio all these different layouts. So once let's say you've created your very basic process, which is like once you open up Studio, you go create a new project, create a new process, and then you would land in this screen, okay? Usually it comes with the main workflow, okay? You would end up with this main.xaml file, okay? It's always empty and don't worry, okay? Meaning that that main will be the entry point for your automation. And here you see these three tabs, right? The home, design, and debug. Under design, you would see this new. And once you hit that drop down, you can see all the different types of workflows that you can create. So here's your sequence, and here's your flowchart, and here's your state machine and the global handler. So we will mostly be using the sequence for this exercise here, and that's the most common one that's being used. All right. Any questions so far? And again, like feel free to use the chat at any point in time. If you do have questions, like post it out there. Okay. Moving on to the next topic, which is the arguments. Okay. Now that you all have learned like what is a variable and what is like the workflow layout within UiPath, now is the time where you learn what is an argument. An argument is exactly like similar to the variable, except that this is not confined to your workflow. An argument is used to carry, it's again a placeholder, a container for you to hold those values, but it's used to pass this value outside the workflow to another workflow. So for instance, now that we've learned like you can build like separate sequences, imagine you have like two separate XAML files, like a main.xaml, and then you create like a separate like main1.xaml. Then you can pass this value from one XAML to another using the arguments. And with these arguments comes directions. So since you're going to be passing values, you're going to either pass values into the workflow, or you need to get it as an output from that workflow, which is where you would specify the directions here. Okay. So an analogy that I would like commonly use to my students like in other classes is that variables are like your local state police. They have jurisdiction like within that specific area, whereas like a federal government like within and would be the argument that has like a higher level of jurisdiction, which means like it can talk outside and also like work locally. So imagine that variables are like, again, placeholders, but you would use it within your sequence. Whereas arguments, you use it to pass values in and out of your workflows. Okay. So like I said, You can again store these values dynamically, and they come with the same kind of data types, and they have the same methods and properties. The only difference that we would see here is that you would use the direction, which is you would specify either you're going to get the values inside, or you're going to like calculate something and you need to pass the results outside, then you would specify the direction out. Or it couldn't be both. Like sometimes you can get a value, perform some actions, then the value gets modified, and then you need to pass it out, then you would specify as in and out. Okay, and this direction tells the robot like what is it supposed to do with that placeholder. So let's take a look. Hold on here. Okay, so back to Studio here. In this designer panel, we saw where the variables panel are, right? So right next to it, you click on arguments, you would come into the arguments panel. So here you can click and you can build your first argument. So I'm going to say like invoice number, meaning that it's coming inside. So which is where you would specify the direction here. So the default direction that you would see is the in, and then you can specify the type. Just like the variables, you would see the same kind of data types, and you can browse for more here. Okay, so here's like a very simple like pictorial representation of what this is. So you would like have your workflow, and here's your second workflow. So from here, you can pass data into the workflow too. Or you can perform actions here in workflow 2 and then send the results back to workflow 1. Or if you want to like collaborate between these two workflows, you can set it to type in and out. Okay, very similar to variables, you can like create arguments from like the expressions of the activities, or using the property panels that we saw and the arguments panel that I just showed. Okay, so similar to just like how you have a shortcut key for the variables, which is Control K. For the arguments, you would use Control M, which is like using the in direction. But if you want the out direction, you would do Control Shift M. Okay. All right. So Diana,
Are you ready?
here's another fun time for the second question.
Okay. Here we go. Let me just refresh this. Okay, question 2. Don't forget to answer fast. Oops. We'll get there, sorry.
Okay, Menti.
Here we go.
There.
How to pass data between workflows. Is it FedEx, UPS, arguments, or Postman?
So what is the topic that we just learned? That's the clue, guys.
Good job. People are listening.
That's fantastic.
Okay, let's see who's in the front runner now.
Let's see if Sean's still stuck to his place, or do we have like a winner?
Nope, Anthony's.
I think Priya's the winner if it's 100% success on the quiz.
Yeah.
Oh, new leader though.
Yep.
Nice. Congrats, Anthony. But Sean, don't give up. Try to beat him on the next question.
That's right.
Okay, so I'm going to show you like how to use these variables like in an automation really quick, okay, before we proceed with the control flow. And I guess I'm not sharing my screen. Hold on, sorry. And this happens with Zoom. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so like I said, what we're gonna do is for this session, we are gonna go ahead, like pull up your studio, create a very simple process, give it a name, okay? I'm calling it session 2 demo, and you can give it like any name like you want, okay? And you would end up with main.xaml file, okay? And I'm not gonna use any of this, so I'm just gonna like remove all of this because this was just to show you. But don't worry, like you would have like a blank sequence, okay? All right, so the very first step that we are going to do is using this design panel here, go to new and click on sequence, okay? And I'm gonna call it variables demo. Okay, if y'all are getting stuck, do let me know. All right, so inside this variables demo, we are going to create our first variable here, okay? So if you don't see like anything, like if you're like clicking outside, you wouldn't see the ability to create. So the trick here is to click on your sequence, okay? Once you click on your sequence here, you'll be able to see this create variable option, okay? So I'm going to call my first variable as value1. Okay, once you type it, hit enter, it's a string, and that's it. So you've created your first variable. Okay, I'm going to go to my activities panel here. I'm going to click on this assign. I'm going to give that value 1, which is the placeholder. Right now it's empty. Okay, I'm going to give it a value. So once I hit on assign, click on the left side, which is the 2, and type value 1. Okay, since it's of type string, I'm going to use double quotes so that like string is always like, remember this, like string is always enclosed in like double quotes. Okay, so I'm going to put double quotes here and put in hello. All right, so we have our very first variable created and it now has a value. Okay, I'm going to create a second variable here. Okay, but this time I'm going to get the value from the user. All right, so I'm going to use an activity called input dialog. Okay, this input dialog is just basically like asking the user, hey, give me a value here. Like, what is it that you want to ask from the user? Okay, on the title, you can just give like any title. So it's just the name for that box. So I'm just going to say like get value 2 or just get name. We can just say get name, simpler. Okay, in the input label, which is where it'll like ask you to specify what's the phrase that it's going to ask in that message box, in that dialog box. Sorry. So I'm going to say enter value for name. Okay. And then I'm going to leave it as a text box. I want that as a text. So here's where we are going to use the option 2, which is using that Control K option. So I'm going to click on this value entered right here, and I'm going to press Control K. All right. Once you hit Control K, you see how it changes to set var, meaning like set the variable. Okay. So I'm going to specify what's my variable name. Okay. So once you create that, you would see the name being created in this variables panel here. Okay, so now I have a value here. Now I'm just going to print it to see like if all of this is coming right. Okay, so I'm going to use the log message here. It's kind of my favorite. So I'm going to print the first variable, which is the value 1. I'm going to add it. So use the plus. I'm going to add it with a second variable. Okay, but before we do that, I want to like add a space. So I'm just going to use a string here, like just an empty string with just a simple space. And then I'm going to call the second variable, which is the name. Okay, so I used a log message, call the first variable, which is the value 1. And since I just want to add a space to it, I'm going to use the string here. Okay, and then I'm using the second variable, which is called the name. All right. And in your design studio, if you don't see this run file, if it says run project, don't worry, you can always go and change those settings only if you want to. But if you don't see that run file, you can click on that drop down, and I always use the run file. Because if you hit the run project, what it does, it starts from the main, which is your entry point workflow. Okay, but in this case, I only want to run this specific workflow, which is the run file. So hit this drop down here, and we are going to do a run file. It kind of switches there. I promise you there's a pop-up box that's going to come up anytime. My machine's kind of slow. There it is. Okay, so it's asking me for a name. Okay, I'm going to call it, yeah, I'll put in my name. So I'm going to just use your name and hit enter. Okay, so once you hit enter, if you see in this output panel right here, it printed the first variable, which is holding a hello, and then we added a space here. And the second input that I gave was hello Priya. Okay, so it printed both of these concatenated, like meaning like it added both of them together, and it printed here as hello Priya. Okay, I'm gonna run that again one more time. All I do is run file. For some odd reason, it's just taking a while. Come back here. There we go. So it gives me that pop-up. So remember like how we added the title, which is the get name. You can see the title for this input dialog. And this is the input label. This is the question that we asked. Enter the value for the name. That's what it's here. Okay, I'm going to put Diana's name this time. Okay, and then I hit OK. As you can see, it prints the output. Hello, Diana. Awesome. So that's how you build your first variable. Okay, and again, like you can use like multiple sequences, and like you can use like various different ways and try different data types as well. All right. And any questions so far, please feel free to ask in the chat below. Okay. Oh, we also did the arguments. So I'm just going to show you how to use the arguments. Okay, now that you've created like a simple workflow using the variables, let's go ahead and build the arguments. Okay, so I'm going to go again, build a new sequence. Okay, and for arguments, remember, you have to have like 2 workflows for it to talk. Okay, because arguments is usually to pass the values in or inside or outside another workflow. Okay, so I'm just going to call it arguments demo. Okay. And once we have that, like you should see that workflow here. I already had one created. That's why you would see like additional ones, arguments and variables here. But again, give it a meaningful name. So this one is called arguments demo. Okay. So we are going to create our next first argument here. Okay, I'm going to click on create argument. I'm just going to call it user. Okay, and I'm going to leave it with the in direction because I want to get an input from the workflow that we have built here. All right, so I'm going to call it the user. Okay, and then I'm gonna use a log message in here. And this is just for us to know that like you are inside this workflow, okay? So I'm just gonna put in a message saying like executing from within arguments workflow, okay? And this is just like, imagine this is just like a message to yourself, reminding that like this is happening inside this workflow. So when we look at the output, we should be able to know where is this coming from, okay? So I'm going to use that argument here, which is the user, and I'm going to add a message in there. So I'm going to say, congratulations. You have created, my spelling right now, created your first argument. All right. So we have created our first argument. Now, if you notice, like the argument value for the user is not assigned, okay? For it to have a value, you need to pass it from another workflow, right? So now save this and like we'll go back to this variables demo, and I'm just gonna like simply use this input that we just passed. Like for the second demo that I just showed you, I used Diana, right? So we are gonna ask like the same kind of input from the user and pass that value to the arguments, okay? So for that, I'm gonna like switch to this projects tab, like on the left-hand side, you would see this, and I'm gonna, you see this arguments demo, the workflow that we just created. I'm just gonna drag and drop it right below here. Okay, so all I did was just drag and drop it here, and it would create this invoke arguments demo. Okay. And then I click on this import arguments. So you see here, there are two buttons. You can either open the workflow or import arguments. So I'm just going to import arguments and I'm going to assign that value. So what is the variable, second variable name called? We called it name. So I'm going to use that here. That's the value that is going to get passed as the username. Okay. So once again, going back to the arguments. So you created a simple argument that is of type string and with the direction in. And I used a simple message, use that argument, and then said, congratulations, you have created your first argument. And then save this workflow, then go back to the previous workflow that we created, which is the variables demo. And inside that, I'm just going to drag and drop this workflow that we just created, which is the arguments demo. So all you have to do is just drag and drop it here, and then click on import arguments and use the second variable name. Okay. Now we are going to run it from this variables demo here. So again, it's going to prompt. My system, for some reason, takes a few seconds, so don't worry. Hang in there. Okay. So it's asking me for a name. Okay, this time I will say like my name is Brian. Sorry, Brian, I'm impersonating you. Okay. So you see this output panel right here. So it said like from here, it said the hello, Brian. And then it said executing from within the arguments workflow. And then it said, Brian, congratulations, you have created your first argument. All right.
Well, that's not my first argument.
Yes, although like Brian has like done like thousands of automations. So like, yep, definitely.
Sorry,
not
I was talking about my wife.
Oh. Okay. All right. So give us a thumbs up like in the chat that like if you were able to like complete this exercise. And this is pretty simple as we dive into the next section. So and again, like if you do have any questions, don't feel shy. No question is a silly question. So always go to the chat, ask your questions right away.
They liked your joke, Brian. I'm not sure why.
I bet they were all like husbands. Okay. All right. moving on to the next topic then, which is the control flow. Okay, now that you know like how to create your variables and arguments and what the different layouts are, like now you can move on to the idea of creating an automation with like different varying conditions. So we can specify like different loops, or like, you know, you can specify different conditions. So for you to understand what is a control flow, meaning that how your activities are being executed. So within that sequence, we said like, this is the order in which it's going to go, right? So within a control flow, you're going to specify in which order is that activity is going to be executed or evaluated. So here are some of the activities that are currently available in the control flow section. So as you can see the do while, else if, for each, if, parallel, and switch and while. So some of these are loops and some of these are conditions, okay? So you need to understand what is the importance of using these control flow. The control flow basically like takes care of the order in which like all these specific activities are performed. And also it comes in very handy when you have to make decisions based on like, if this was the case, do these actions. Or if this was the condition, if this condition satisfies, then do this other action. Or if you have a collection, let's say you have like a list of names, and for all those names, you need to do a certain set of actions, then you can use like loops and do those actions all together. Okay. And loops within this automation, it can run for like any number of time that you specify, or up until like the condition is met. So it can be like running forever if the condition is not met. So be cautious when you set the loops that you're not running on like an infinite loop that it keeps on going forever. Okay, so there are three types of control statements here. The first one is the conditional statement. Like I said, it's very important for your decision-making activities. So within any automation, you need to like make decisions for it to be like automated, right? So you give it like slight complicated cognitive abilities. So here's where we would use like activities like if, else if, and switch. So you're gonna say, if the mark is so much, you say you're passed or you fail. Or like you say, if this threshold is met, then you do this action. Otherwise, you do this other action. So that's where like these kind of conditional activities like are very helpful. And loops, for instance, we have the while, do while, and for each loop. So those are executed up until that condition is met, or the number of times that you have specified for. Okay. And a parallel activity is an activity that like executes like simultaneously the child activities. It just happens in parallel. Okay. So we're going to look at the first conditional statement, which is the if. So we have a condition. So here's how your if activity looks like. So you have the if you drag and drop, if you drag and drop the if, it would have like two things. You would have like two sets of instructions. First is the then part where you specify what happens if the condition is satisfied. And then the else part, which executes if the condition is not satisfied. So imagine the if is a very Boolean. It's pretty black and white. So it's very binary that either like it's 1 or 0. So it's either like true or false. So you always have a definitive like value that comes out. So there is no gray area here, okay? And then the second condition that we have, the second activity that we have is the else if, okay? So the else if, it's very similar to if, except the part that like here, you can have another condition. So if the first condition fails and you want to execute another condition in the else part, then like you can use the else if activity. So with this else if, first you specify, let's say your mark is like, you check if the mark is over 90%, okay? If it's 90%, you're gonna print like congratulations. And then you have like a second else if condition to check, let's say if the mark is like over 60%. And there, like if it's over 60%, you can say like you could have done better. And in the else part, you could have said like, you can still add another condition that checks like if the mark is less than or less than 40%. Because if it's less than 40%, you're gonna print like you have failed. Okay, so you can like specify these kind of conditions like as many times as you want, and there is always gonna be this then part and also the else part. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna do another simple exercise here. So let's go ahead and build like a simple workflow. Again, like I'm using a sequence, I'm just gonna call it the if demo. Okay. And I'm gonna use a variable here. I'm gonna call it marks. I'm gonna use it of type integer, meaning that it's gonna be a number. And I'll give it like a, we can either give it a default value, or in this case, I'm gonna like give the marks as like 90%. Okay. And then I'm gonna use the if condition. So I just double clicked, or you can drag and drop the activity here. Okay, so as you can see here, they've changed just slightly this layout. So if you don't see the else part, just click on the show else, and you should see this layout right here. So you have the condition to specify, and then what's the then part, and then the else part. Okay, so I'm gonna say if marks, if you've scored more than 80%, maybe that's probably too high. Let's lower that. Let's say like if you've scored more than 60, I'm just gonna print a value here. I'm just gonna say congrats, you've passed. Okay. And if it's not over 60%, we're gonna print a message again. Please study well. Okay. So I'm just gonna run this file now. And again, like we've scored 90%. So guess what's gonna be the message being printed? For some reason, my studio takes a while. Okay, as you can see, it says, congrats, you've passed. Let's change the score, okay? Let's say like I only got like 45. What do you think the message should be? It says, please study well. Guess I gotta bring my books back. Okay, so this is how like you would use the if condition, all right? And here we have another quiz. So I'm gonna move over to Diana again.
Okay, let's see if it works this time, guys. You ready? There we go. What instructions are available in if activity? Then else, maybe not. Do it, don't do it. Why? Why not?
I know the option 3 sounds enticing, but the right option is then and else.
Yeah. Good job. Everybody got it.
I love it. Okay, so over to Brian. Brian's going to take you through the rest of the conditional statements, and also he's going to be walking you through the loops.
There we go, off mute and everything. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Center, and Priya has been kind enough to share her day with me, and I get to share it with you. I'm very excited. So I have a few slides to share, and then it's all live action. So let me start that up, and then now I'll share my screen first. Okay. There we go. All right, everybody see the conditional control statements switch at the top?
Yes.
Okay, super. So what's a switch? It's sort of like a fancy if then, it's a sort of like a fancy if else, or Elsif, I should say. In fact, it's the Elsif from my day. Elsif is kind of a new construct, switch is old. The main difference between, so like Elsif, you have a test with multiple branches that you can use as depending on the result of the test. The difference between switch and Elsif that I would say is that switch, there's only one evaluation. So the variable is evaluated one time, and then you branch based on the value. With the Elsif, you can have completely different tests in each else. It doesn't have to be, is it greater than 70, else if it's greater than 60. It can be, if Priya said it, else if Brian said it. Okay, so completely different things can be in there. Now here's a real world case. This one's kind of complex. Don't get too nervous. But so in this case, I used regex to extract a keyword from the subject of email, and then that keyword is evaluated one time. You know, I look at this today and I say, well, you know, I could have used contains created, contains amendment, contains cancellation, and done the whole thing in an else if. But that's just not the way I did it. One thing that I do want to point out here is the importance of documenting your code, because this is a real world example of a relatively complex program, and someone else had to maintain this program after I had set it up. Fortunately, the email subjects that I was using for that test that went through the regex, I just listed them in there so that it was easy for someone to come back and modify this later and understand, for example, if there was a new transaction type. We had there was a deleted gets added, and that's sort of like a cancellation, but different. We would be able to just modify the regex, put in a new deleted case, and off we go. I don't want to go too deep on that, but switch can work just like the else if, and document your code, be a friend. All right, while is a loop, and while is a loop that tests the condition. So while will execute a series of steps over and over and over while a condition is true. So it's possible for a while loop to have 0 executions. You can bypass the while altogether. So if your goal is to add 1 as you go through this loop until you get to 100, if it's 100 before it gets there, never even goes through the loop. Do while is the same theory, same practice, the same logic of executing over and over, but the test is at the end. So you always execute the body of the do while, whereas you might never execute the body of the while loop. Great example here. You want to check on a screen, so you do the refresh in the do while, and then check for the result after. So did the refresh expose the element that I'm looking for? So you can tie it all right into that tight little piece of logic. for each is it allows you to execute based on the contents of a list or an array or all kinds of things. So I'll show you more about that in the example, but say for each file name in a folder, for each email in a list of emails that I'm working with. And it goes through there literally every single one. So this is great. This is funny for me. So I'm old school guy, and the break activity was always considered not good manners, or if you had to have a break in your loop, it was frowned upon. It was taught to me that then you probably didn't build your loop correctly. It was the equivalent of using a go-to in your code, which I was raised on go-tos. So so it was something that, to me, I used a break. So if I've got a long list of activities that I'm doing in a loop, but in the first step, I've already solved my issue, I don't have to go through the rest of it, and break will take me to the next statement after the loop. Continue lets you break to the end of the current iteration, but you stay in the loop. So you go back around again and again. So you don't necessarily have to be in the while loop or the do while loop forever, or even until the condition is really there. You can break out. So you could have a do while that is executing until a certain value is found, but you can have a break in there that checks an if statement with a check to say, well, if I've done this 100 times, I give up, and break out. And with that, we'll go straight to live action. So I have a question. It seems like everybody's trying to follow along with this. That was not exactly what I expected, but I'm with it. With pacing, okay? Because I'm not sure that I'm afraid I might end up going quicker than you want. But I'm going to start a brand new project, and I'm going to start it out as a process. And I'm going to call that process, let's see, how many students do we still have in here? I think it was 91 the last time I looked at it. So we're going to call this Studio 2. Developer 2, use the new words, Brian. And I could put a comment in here. Be confused between whether you're going to be using C# and Visual Basic in your commands, by the way. I will just stick with C. All right, and let's take a look at my instructions here. I'll pull this over where everybody can see it real quick. We're working on exercise 3, so we're going to work using the do while loop, and we're going to create a guessing game where a random number, and the user enters a number, and we tell them if they're high or low, and then they get to guess again. So the first thing we want to do is create a new sequence. And we're going to call this sequence do while. And the first thing we're going to do in the do while is add a do while loop. So you can see we've got the body that we're going to use, and we've got the condition that we're going to execute. Really, before I really get going, I'm going to want to, we need to start with a number. So let's create a number. And we're going to do that with an assignment statement. And in that assignment statement, we're going to make a new random next 1 and 11. It's going to give us a random number between 1 and 10. And we're going to assign that to robot number. Many people would assign that to int robot number, but I'm going to just call it robot number because I just don't get that excited about it. I'll tell you, when I work with a data table, I always prefix it with a DT just because that one's going to hurt me eventually. But oh, look at that, Brian. What did I do wrong? How come I don't have a variable? Because I didn't press Control K. Now I've got a robot number, but you can see that created it as a string type, and I definitely want this to be an integer. So let's go grab the int 32. And now my assignment statement is happy. I'm going to rename this to assign robot number. This is also if you're doing debugging and you have a whole lot of assignment statements, you'd want to be able to tell which is which. So it's important, especially within the workflow, to name it something that you can trace it back to. It'll save you a lot of time later. And just to make sure that we can find out what happened, I'm going to add a log message as well. And what this is going to do is it's going to write a line into the output log that lets me see that I created a number and what it is. So if I'm debugging it later and I just don't understand why I can't guess the right number, at least through the debugger I can see what's going on. Because this is informational message to me, I'm going to make info, and we can string together variables here. So robot number is, use the plus sign, and then robot number shows up right at the top of the list because that's my variable. And that didn't work because it's not a string. Let's make the string, and that should make everything happy. So in fact, let's go ahead and delete this. We'll add it back, but I'm going to go ahead and test this right now. So we can run the debug file, and it'll charge through what we just did. You can see it started. Robot number is 1. Let's pull up the output again to take a closer look at that. So it started, I successfully assigned a number, and the number is 1. Let's do it again just to make sure my randomness is working. And now it's 9. So I'm going to call that pretty good. So let's add in the do while. We can also browse for the do while. Let's go ahead and show that one time. And so we can browse or we can search. So we'll go ahead and grab it. Okay. So let's see, what are my instructions again? Generate a number, prompt the user to enter a number, and then add the if else to check the number and interact with the user. So really, what's the first thing we're going to do here in the do while is we're going to get some input from the user. You know, Diane, I see that we're up against our time. Am I right about that?
Yes, we can stay a few minutes over if you want.
Well,
I
let me
think
do
we're okay.
this. Rather than watching me type these things, I already did this once in preparation for the class, so I'm gonna walk through it real quick. I bet I can do this in about 10 minutes. Is it show of hands if that's a good thing for the class?
How much
Are you
longer do
seeing
you have, Brian?
Diana, or does nobody want any part of this?
No, how much longer do you have?
Well, if I have 2 demos to do, and if I do them both, it's going to take a while. So let's see the pre-baked. Let's see the pre-baked pie. Oh, come on.
Maybe we could finish this demo and then I can finish the Menti quiz, and then if anybody wants to leave, they can. And if not, they can.
I'm not going to actually execute the demo. I'm going to walk through the already done code.
Okay.
Oh, I wish I could make this go away. There we go. I did it. All right. So here we assigned the number. It's like I just did. We logged the message. In the do while, we asked the user to guess a number. There's a title, some text, and then we take the value as a string. Then I go ahead and I log this into the log as well, into the output as well. But I don't really want a string at all, do I? I want an integer, so I'm going to convert it to an integer. Using the convert command. Pop that up. On the screen. So I can just code that right there. So let's get down to the logic part. At the bottom, my number is not equal to my guess, then I'm going to go through again, right? So I'm going to keep doing this as long as my number equals the user's guess. So when robot number, as long as my number equals guess, everything is good. But since we also wanted to let the user a hint, they can do a binary search or however they're going to go through this, we're going to check to see with Elsif. So in the Elsif, I'm going to say, okay, is the guess less than the robot number? The answer is yes. Then we're going to say was too low. Guess again. Then I'm going to check to see if their guess was greater than my number, which better be true at this point, right? Well, not necessarily. This could be the condition where they were successful. So if it's greater than my number, we're going to say, oh, that was too high. Guess again. And if they guess the right number, we're going to tell them that they won. And then the last step I'm going to do in this is log a message into the output that says the game is over. So let's go ahead and run this. So the first thing we get is enter a number between 1 and 10. I'm going to guess 6. And my message box comes up and tells me, I guess again. I'm going to guess 3 this time. Still too high. Guess again. I'm going to guess 2. Still too high. I'm thinking it might be 1 then. If it's not 1, I have a logic error. Oh, there we go. I win. Now let's come back and look at the log. So you can see we started up. I logged that the number was one. Well, didn't I log that what my robot picked 1? My number is 1. That was the robot's number. Your number is a 6, your number is 3, your number is 2, your number is 1, and then game over. So some logging in there, real good way to debugging out. If you'll indulge me for 1 second, there's one thing I really wanted to show off with the for loop, and that is that snippets. So snippets are bits of code that are pre-written you're going to use over and over and over. So there's snippets that'll provide a delay. But we're going to use one that's for specifically our for loop. And one that I did in the example is for each file and folder. And take a look at how much of your work is done for you with this. It's super, super productive to use snippets. So select folder, that allows you to browse to a folder, and all you have to do is provide a variable to put it into. I've got one that's already set up. And then the interim version of files is already set up, and it's got a basic thing in there to write a text file. You can literally write this exercise. If you use the snippet in your hurry, you can probably be done in 10 minutes. And that's the end of what I got, Diana. If you want to take it away, I will stop sharing.
Okay, great. Back to our
Oh,
quiz.
look, people are still here. I'm excited. I apologize for running out of time. I hope that was still valuable for everybody. And when I looked, I didn't see a way to download the exercise that I thought I had shared with the last one, but there was a link in the PowerPoint, but I'm not sure that worked in the Slido. But I'll put that exercise out there with a link in the file, and if you don't get it there, I'll post it into the forum too if you want.
Great, thanks, Brian. So let's finish our quiz. Which loop can be used to perform a series of actions on every item in a collection? The boomerang, the circle, for each, or roundabout?
I'm so glad that people are liking this Menti, that they stick
This is
around.
great. Yeah. So yeah, you guys are doing great. I want you to know that I live in a whole city of roundabouts, so I'm glad that wasn't the answer. Okay, great. Let's see who's the winner. Wow, Jenna, you
Wow,
pulled it
Jenna.
up. Yeah. So Jenna, if you'll please put your email address in the chat box for me, that would be great. Thank you. And then I just want to thank Priya and Brian for presenting today. This is great. We'll open it up for a few questions. But I just want to also thank everybody for coming. There are a couple things that I want to remind you guys of. Don't forget to register for the next class. We want to make sure that you get all the information you can, and you can always go back to the videos and to the presentations to answer more questions. Don't forget to sign up for the forum, where we have a whole group of MVPs from the Americas that monitor that, so you'll get answers to anything you're having issues with. And lastly, don't forget that the video and the presentation will be available after tomorrow, probably not until Monday, because the person from EMEA is going to post it. But the presentation will definitely be up, but definitely by Monday, the video and everything should be there. So now, if
One thing I
anybody-
want to mention is you can save the chat. Highly recommend save the chat, hit the 3 buttons to do that and save that out.
For sure. So with that, anybody have any quick questions that they want to ask?
Yeah, and I think like someone asked a question, when is the next class? It's on August 10th. If I'm not mistaken. It's I'll post the link right here. It's around the same time. And it's for the studio track again. So you have like session 3 during that time, and you probably go over the UI automation. So they'll teach you like what are the recorders available. So we highly recommend like after this class, I would say like if you do have time, please use the Academy and go through this variables, arguments, and control workflow in Studio. If you go in the Academy, you'll be able to find that course. So there's a search that you can use within the Academy and just look for this variables, arguments, and control flow. And that will also like walk you through the loops and the conditions as well. And and you can always like find us on the forums or LinkedIn. So Brian and I are like active on the forums as well. So if you do have questions, Ryan's posted the chat in the chat for the forum thread. So feel free to use that. And again, like any question is more welcome. So if you ever hit a wall, just ask. Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody, for spending your Friday afternoons and days with us. And we'll leave it there. But please come to the next session and learn some more from us.
Who's leading the next session? Do you know off the